The Polyglot Gathering is brought to you by italki. Become fluent in any language.
All right, welcome. My name is Judith Meyer, and I will talk to you about how to boost your vocabulary in non-European languages, because I find that in European languages it's comparatively easy to learn a lot of words. A lot of them you recognize, a lot of them sound somewhat familiar. Sometimes you can make good mnemonics, but when you're learning non-European languages, it gets much more difficult. Even thinking of random mnemonics gets more difficult because you have less associations for the sounds that you might find in the word, or you might have to take it into account that there's also a tone to go with it, or there are a lot of words that essentially have the same structure, like in the Semitic languages. So basically it makes a lot more sense to work with affixes and to understand what's going on a more basic level, and use that in order to build your vocabulary. And in this presentation I will be giving examples from Hebrew, Indonesian, Swahili, Chinese, Esperanto, Modern Greek and German. Not so much Modern and Greek and German because these are the more boring languages, but essentially this is not a presentation for those who are planning to learn these languages in particular, but people who are learning any kind of non-Indo-European language, or any language in which you have trouble with the vocabulary. You can probably apply some of these tips and get your tutor to tell you the equivalent in other languages. Okay, so much for the introduction. First, I would talk about the suffixes that you can use for people. And what I found really useful in this context is to look at Esperanto suffixes for people. There are essentially three kinds. And the first one is the anto prefix, a suffix is for people who are currently doing something. So canti is to sing, and if you say cantando, it's someone who is currently singing. Then ullo is for someone who regularly does something, maybe as a hobby. So cantulo is someone who maybe participates in a choir as a hobby. And isto is for someone who professionally does something. Cantisto, it would be a professional singer. So that is three different ways that we can think of people who are somehow connected to a verb or a noun that we can imagine. And I found that this maps interestingly onto Chinese. If you're interested in that, I wrote an article actually comparing Esperanto and Chinese suffixes for people, because you can see a lot of parallels. But right in this presentation I will look at various languages. So here's Hebrew. We have an equivalent for the anto suffix. I will always write in transliteration so that you can compare more easily. So for example, mesaper would be tells. This is the present tense form. Mesaper is he or she tells, and then the same word also means a storyteller. Or matril is to start, or he starts. And matril is also the word for beginner. Or mishtatev is he participates, or as the participant. Then in Indonesian you change the prefix from an M to a P, but it is essentially the same idea. You have a word mengajar, which means to teach, and then pengajar is the teacher. Membeli, to buy, pembeli, the buyer, menjual, to sell, penjual, the seller. You can go from one to the other, except that in Indonesian you don't have this distinction between the person who is currently doing something and the one who regularly does something, or the professional. So in some languages you will have this distinction, and in some languages you won't. In Hebrew you do have the distinction, that's why I started with Hebrew. In Swahili you have the same kuimba, mwimbaji, kusikiliza, msikilizaji. So you can kind of see a pattern. It's a bit difficult because of the vowel and non-vowel, but there again you have sing, singer, listen, listener. In Chinese you would use this with the zhe, and I wrote it down, the character for it as well, because in Chinese it makes a difference. So here you would use the verb and then you add 者 for someone that does something. 参加者, 倾听者. Okay, in this case the common verb would just be 听 and not 倾听, but in Chinese they like to be shorter, so for the most common verb you would use 听听, and then for the 倾听者, for the noun, you need a longer word. But essentially, you can remember that this 者 fulfills the same purpose. And I'm not saying to remember all this that I'm saying right now, but simply to keep in mind that if you're learning a language, you can look for this relation, and you should ask your tutor to tell you how do I do this? If I have a verb to listen, how do I get from listen to listener? How do I get from sing to singer? How do I get from participate to participant? And to learn the regularity in order to boost your vocabulary. Then for the ulo, which is someone who regularly does something, you have le sachek, sachkan, le rakod, rakdan. It's a bit more complicated in Hebrew. It always will be because of the root system, where the vowels sometimes get swapped out or sometimes disappear. But essentially the same idea. You add the an at the end to go from player to player and dance to dancer. In Swahili as well, you have the same pattern as before. Here in Chinese, you're more likely to see the jia ending, jia suffix, hua jia, painter, 作文, 作家, compose and writer. And in the last category for professionals, you have a different pattern again in Hebrew. So Hebrew really uses the same three kinds of people that you can build based on the verb form. So here you have a bit of a problem. Wait, can I get a yes? Okay. So here you have to think that in Hebrew only the consonants matter. So in a verb stem like linhok, you have the N, the H, and the G that will reappear here in NHG, and here SPR. That's why I wrote them in capital letters, so that you can recognize that they are still there. It's takes some getting used to. It's actually my biggest enemy in learning Hebrew is to to see these and to not get confused, because the words afterwards all sound the same in the Hag Tzapa. They will all have the same kind of pattern. Okay, so another thing is you don't necessarily need to do this with verbs, but it can also be with a noun like Musik, Musikai, Iton, Itonai. So based on the word for music, you can make the word for musician. Based on the word for newspaper, you can make the word for a person who professionally works with newspapers. It is a journalist. And it's the same in Esperanto. With the isto, you can say gazeto is a newspaper, gazetisto can be the journalist, or musico, musikisto, or I don't know, any of the words also work in Esperanto. Yes?
When you say itonai there, that specifically means a journalist working for a newspaper, or can they also be television and magazine?
You'd have to ask an Israeli, but I think it's for a newspaper.
Okay.
Yeah, a newspaper.
It's only newspaper. Okay.
Okay, in Swahili you have the same. You can use a word like physikia for physics, and then you have wana physikia for physicist. It's maybe not too surprising that you can do that with the foreign words that have entered the language. Kunyoa, kunyosi, okay. In Chinese it's more likely to be shi at this case, the shi suffix, which looks like this one that you may recognize from lao shi for teacher. Li fa shi is the barber, and lu shi is the lawyer. The problem is here that again you have a bit of a shortening, so the word for law is fa lu, and then you get lu shi. So it's not entirely predictable, but if you know that that words work like this, then you can somehow guess them, and even if you can't guess them, you can remember them more easily. Here's some examples from Greek. Physiki, physics, physikos, musiki, musikos, mathematica, mathematikos. So same pattern. You always have this stressed os in order to talk about people who are professionally doing physics or music or mathematics. And this is actually not the most interesting part of what you can do with the prefixes and suffixes, because you have the same thing in English with the ER, essentially write, writer, and sing, singer. But there are other kinds of patterns that I found that exist in very many of the world's languages, and that I would show you now. One is, okay, this is still maybe familiar. You can create a noun from a verb. So ado, drinki is to drink alcohol, drinkado is the drinking or getting drunk as a noun. Likro, kria, lichtov, ktiva. It's the same idea again. You need to, in Hebrew, you always need to take the essential letters and then fit them into this pattern, which includes the vowel I and the vowel A. And then you treat the global stop as another consonant, and you say kriya, ktiva is the same pattern. Diavazo, diavasma, baptizo, baptisma, kapnizo, kapnisma, same idea, to read and reading, to baptize and baptism, to smoke and smoking. In Swahili here you would just use the verb itself with the preposition ya, which is off. So, for example, you have to verify kuhakikisha, and verification counter would be counter ya kuhakikisha. So a counter of verification, or off to verify. So they really just use the infinitives there. And now for something more interesting. This is connections that you can't really do in English, which is you have a verb and then you create something that is verbed, if you want. So with the example here, to write and a letter, something written, literally, but it means letter, or to read and something that is read, which means the Torah, or to play and something that is played, a game. In Esperanto this would be with the suffix ajo. So scribajo, scribi, scribajo, legi, legajo, ludi, ludajo, something that is played, something that is written, something that is read. Or you can use the same suffix in order to create the word for food, something that's eaten, or the word for a beverage, something that is drunk. That is the same pattern, and I found it in many languages. So here you have the same in Indonesian, membelian. I put a dash there so that you can see it more clearly, what part is the prefix and what part is the part that matters, because it's difficult to explain in many languages at once. So the important part here is beli for buying, and then beli an. The an makes it a noun, meaning something that is bought. Or menjual, to sell, jualan, something that is sold, sales. Bekerja an, the works. In Swahili, same idea. Here you use a prefix, ma. Okay, the ku is a prefix for infinitive, and the ma is for the object, which is ajo in Esperanto. So you have the same, kuuza, to sell, ma uzo, the sales. Kuonyesha, to show, maonyesho, exhibition, something that is shown. Kueleza, maeleza, to explain, and explanation, the thing that is explained. Then you can also create places or tools from your verbs. Drinkejo is a place to drink. A pub, a place to get drunk, drinkejo. In Esperanto with ejo. In German is often with I, or at least when it comes to places in the city. You have Bäcker, baker, and Bäckerei, bakery. Metzger, Metzgerei. Bücher, Bücherei. Butcher, butcher shop. Books, and library. In Hebrew you have the prefix mi for this. So lisod, misada, lichtov, michtava. And here, this is something that really gave me pause in Arabic. Actually, when I learned it, katab for to write, and then maktab. And maktab can mean office or desk. And I was like, how can they have the same word for office and desk? Until I thought it is actually scribeio. It's actually a place for writing. And a place for writing, if you're thinking very small, could be a desk. But if you're thinking larger, then it could be an office.
In French also.
Yes, but in French you don't have the explanation. It's just a word that happens to be the same. It's not based on the word to write. But here I saw the word to write, and I'm like, how can they use the same word in order to get there? And it's actually the irregular prefix that they have. In Arabic it's ma, and in Hebrew it's mi, for a place. In Swahili you only have the words that are influenced from Arabic, essentially. They have a lot of words that start with M that denote a place, like hava mkahava, coffee, and a place to get a coffee is a cafe, or kitabu. This is just from Arabic, maktaba. In Chinese usually ends in dien, but it's also it's more like the word more like I in German. It's just a suffix for places in the city. Fan dien, food and restaurant. Shu dien, book and bookstore. And you can also go in some languages. This is less common, but you can also talk about tools. And in Esperanto that would be ilo. So scribi is to write, and scribilo is something that you use to write. Can you guess what that would be?
Pencil.
Yeah, like a pencil, or it could be a pen, or it could be anything that you use to write. So scribilo. Here in Hebrew, the word for calculate and computer, a tool for calculation, or screw and the verb to screw and screwdriver, and to print and printer. They all use the same pattern, which is a ma in front, and then two consonants, and then the e and the final consonant. So in Hebrew you always have to pay attention. There's three basic consonants in a verb, which is the root consonants, and then you arrange them for in this pattern in order to get a tool. So lechashev is to calculate, and machshev is the computer. Lehavrig, mavreg. And so on. In Chinese this would be with D. D is more like a machine or something electronic usually. So da-in D, print and printer again. Or they also do the same with to fly and airplane, or move and motor. So these are words where it doesn't really work in English, but it works in Chinese and in a bunch of other languages. You can also see the same pattern. And in German, drucken, Drucker, rechnen, Rechner, this works for very few words in German. I really found, I don't know, maybe it's just because I was looking for these connections, but it seemed to me that in non-European languages you have more of these connections, or they're more visible. You have a verb and you can build more places, more tools, more things and people based on these words. Of course, one of the most important things you need to know if you're learning a language is how to turn a noun into an adjective or vice versa. Here, the word for catastrophe in Greek, katastrophikos. So in Greek we have a pattern of just having ikos at the end. Kedro, kedikos, center and central. Kinonia, kinoninkos. The community and communal or common or social, any of these. In Chinese they're actually usually identical because they don't really have the distinction between nouns and adjectives. Here in Swahili you can use it with the key prefix, but usually they have adjectives that work differently, that are not based on nouns. In Hebrew you use T or E, dati, religion, religious, problem, problematic, ba'aya, ba'ayati, So, and then the same word, bayati, you can turn into a noun again and create something that would translate as problematicness, which is kind of like the English tea or German height and kite, these kind of words, with the ut suffix in Hebrew. So, bayati bayati yud, dati dati yud, kal kalut. So it's not just the long, complicated words, but also simple ones like kal kalut, ease, easy, and ease that use the same pattern. This is two things that you absolutely need to know if you're learning a foreign language. How do you turn a noun into an adjective? How do you turn an adjective into a noun? You just double your vocabulary right there. In Greek, arostos, arostia, asphalos, asphalia, omorphos, omorphia. So it's the same idea. You have a final that ends in a I sound and an A. It can be spelled differently. Sometimes there's an accent, sometimes there isn't, but it's the same idea. Just like in German with the Heit ending. Krank, Krankheit, sicher, Sicherheit, schön, Schönheit. In Swahili, you do this with a prefix, so, like almost everything in Swahili. So the letter M is a prefix, which means a person usually, or an animated being. And the U prefix turns this into a general noun of the height kind variety. So mtoto is a child, utoto is childhood, mtu is person or human, utu is mankind, sawa is equal, usawa is equality. And then, okay, one more. Chinese. In Chinese you use xing at the end. 可能性, maybe and possibility. Important and importance, always with xing. And then this bela, malbela. Who here knows Esperanto? Very many people. Nice. So this bela, malbela. Bela is beautiful and malbela is ugly. And you can have the same in most European languages. Here in Greek you have evgenis, agenis. Höflich, unhöflich, in German with un, in English with im or an or ir. It can be difficult. Yes, Dion?
Could you just translate those words to English, please?
Okay, sorry. This is polite, impolite, possible, impossible, safe, unsafe.
Thank you.
And it's always with the a in front, except here you have an. Asphalos, anasphalos, because it already starts with an A.
Thanks.
And in Hebrew, you have an extra I at the front, so rationali, irrationali, sheket, isheket, havana, ihavana. So rational, irrational, quietness, unstableness, and understanding, misunderstanding. In Chinese it's more complicated, but you usually have fei at the beginning. Fei is also the negation. So gung, gungjung is just, feigung is unjust. He fa is according to law. So here you have a prefix already in the normal adjective. He is according to or in accordance with, and fa the law, fei fa, illegal, illegal. And this is where it gets interesting because in Swahili you don't have this with the adjectives so much, but you have it for verbs to make the complete opposite. So kufunga is to close, and then if you add an extra u, just this extra little vowel that you might miss when you're reading it, you have the complete opposite. So you get from close to open, from to load to unload, from to wear to undress. So actually we have the same thought in a lot of languages, that you can reverse something, but in European languages it tends to be just for verbs. In European languages it tends to be just for adjectives, so helpful, unhelpful, or useful, useless. But in Swahili you have the same thing for verbs, and you can say to close and to open with the extra u. And in Swahili you don't have it for adjectives, just for verbs. And the nice thing is that when I translate things to Esperanto, then I always have an equivalent, because in Esperanto it doesn't matter. You can apply it to adjectives, to nouns, to verbs. And when I'm learning non-European languages, I actually really like to translate the words or the word structures immediately to Esperanto, because it helps me understand how the meaning works of this word. I can have an equivalent, an Esperanto equivalent of all of these prefixes and suffixes that I just talked about, with the etso and the eio, the tools, the person, the place. I can translate it exactly like that into Esperanto, and it's often the exact Esperanto word that you would use. And for the rest of the time, it at least gives me a very good understanding of what this word means. You can also, it's also another pattern that you can make things bigger or smaller. In Chinese, to make something bigger, in Esperanto it would be egg, like bella, belega, beautiful, really, really beautiful. In Chinese you double words, da, da, da. What I find really cute is to double both syllables in a two-syllable adjective, so you go from gao xing to gao gao xing xing. In Indonesian it's even more common, but they don't use it for this purpose. So, yeah. Gao xing, gao gao xing xing. Really cute. Yeah, in Hebrew, this is interesting. In Hebrew, it doesn't exist. So I'm not saying that there is a universal grammar, in case anyone is wondering. It's not universal, but it exists in surprisingly many languages, especially when you consider that I'm comparing languages that are from completely different language families. And that means that if you're learning a language, I don't know, Brian could talk about Navajo or something, they may have some of the same concepts, because it seems to be innate to us to think in such categories and not to invent new words all the time for to eat and to food and restaurant, but very often these three words will be related. In Swahili you can do the same, also by duplication. This is actually quite interesting. So to hit and to hit repeatedly is also duplicated. Kupiga, piga, piga. Ruka, ruka, ruka. In Greek, you use ara as a suffix. Ara is for anything big, so mat is match. Mat, matsara is a big match. Rata, ratara, cat and big cat. Avtokinito, avtokinitara, a big car. So it works even with modern words. This is not something innate in the language, but something that they still use in order to create new words. And that is even more important when you're learning a new language and trying to boost your vocabulary. You need to be able to also understand or even create such neologisms. Of course, to make something smaller, this exists in Hebrew. This is interesting. They have the word, they have a suffix or a pattern for making something smaller, but not for making something bigger. So a smaller computer is a calculator, machshev, machshevon. A smaller kitchen is a kitchenette, mitbach, mitbachon. It's always with the on suffix. And sefer, sifron, book and booklet. In Swahili with the ki, mtoto, kitoto, sahani, kisahani. And in Chinese it's doubled usually, or with the R, especially in Beijing. Okay, this just stopped working. So go R, and so on. In Greek you have utsikos as a suffix. Okay, I'm saying it like in Greek we have this. Or in Hebrew you have this. There are always also other possibilities, also to make things bigger. You don't just have ara, you also have argos and other suffixes. And this is just to show you that these patterns exist, and sometimes there is exactly one way to do it, and sometimes there are several ways. I'm not going to explain when to use which one or any of that. Just to get your mind thinking in such patterns and to look for them all. And to get your language partner or your teacher to go over some of these words so that you can start building a model of how to create the words, because textbooks don't tend to do that. I'm not sure, if you look at textbooks, they teach you how to create a past tense. They don't tell you how to create a person from a verb. They don't tell you how to create an adjective from a noun, anything like these. And these could really help you with your vocabulary. So in Greek, freskos, freskoustikos, kind of fresh, kind of tasty, kind of expensive, it's always utsikos. And now okay, this is actually the last thing that I want to say. Let me see how much time I have, because this is a very interesting pattern. It might require a bit of a longer explanation. That is transitivity. There's two ways that it can go, of course, to make something more transitive or less transitive. Mergen is to organize, and mitagen is is organized or is ready in that sense. Meshane, to change, or in the sense of to transform something. Mishana, which turns into mishtana because they don't like the t before the sh sound, so they invert it, they have a sh before t. But essentially you have the distinction in Hebrew between words that start with me and words that start with mit. And the one is transitive and the other one is not. So to transform and to become different, two sides of the same coin. In Greek you have this with the o and the ome vesti, vestigi. I thought I made things a bit more interesting and have some Esperanto translations for you this time. Can Esperanto speaker give the translations? Vesti, vestigi.
To dress. Wear.
The first one is to dress, or to yes, and the other one vestigi.
To get dressed.
Get dressed, yes. Lavigi.
To wash, to get washed, or to wash yourself. Or
Yes, exactly. Shanjiji.
To change something and to be changed.
No, the first one is to change something, and shanjiji is to be changed or become different. Shanjiji. Alazome, yes. Or the other way in Greek uses the iso suffix, so apophasis, apophasizo. Apophasis is the decision, and apophasizo is to make the decision. Asphalis is secura, safe. Asphalizo, to make safe, securigi. This is again where I can use Esperanto because it has the same igi and eg. I can translate every single example in all of the languages, not into all of the languages. It doesn't work if I try to have the same thing in Greek and in Hebrew or in Chinese, because the patterns are not always the same. But in terms of this logical, structured approach to vocabulary, you can translate everything into Esperanto. Miden, zero. Midanizo, to make zero, literally.
Cancel.
Yes, exactly.
Cancel, basically. Nullify.
Yeah, null and nulligi. And you see, even when the base is not a verb, you can still create this. From zero, you get to make zero, to nullify. Indonesian, you have the distinction between the words with bel or ber and meng. Even in the case like belajar, mengajar, kan. Okay, this is two parts, meng and kan. So you put something at the front and you put something at the back, but at the end you have the same idea. Belajar is to learn, and mengajar kan would be to make learn, to make someone learn, to teach. Berhenti, menghentikan, to stop or to stop someone. This is to make it transitive. Berubah, to change or to change something, mengubahkan. Also from adjectives, this is another pattern that you can look for. If you have an adjective big, how to say to make it bigger? Or if you have many, how do you say to increase? How do you say to wide and widen? Short and shorten, this kind of connection. Kecil, mengecil, to become smaller. And so there are two kinds of verbs that you can create based on an adjective. One is to make something bigger, and one is to become bigger. And in English it would usually be the same, like increase. Increase can be to make something increase or to become increased. And in Esperanto they are understandable because of the igi and eg. Igi is to make something or cause something to be, and eg is to become, in a broad sense. In Swahili as well, you have the same idea with the ika suffix, which is to make it intransitive. So from the verb to break, you get to be broken. From the word to change, you get to be changed. Yes, and from close is to be closed from gika, which is not the same as the passive, because Swahili has a different passive, which would be kufungiwa, with always with a W sound, and with the ika, with a K, it's actually the state, to describe the state of being closed. And they use isha for everything that would be igi in Esperanto. So to make close, or to put someone to sleep, not to sleep, but to put someone to sleep, not to give birth, but to literally make someone give birth, which is to deliver. Yeah, to be born, you can say also. That would be with the other one, would be with ika. I think kuzika, but I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, and kuzalisha is to deliver, always with the isha. So, in summary, this is what you should be looking for. With whatever language you're learning, you should be looking how to make adverbs from adjectives. That's the most common case. Even some textbooks tell you how to. But also to make adjectives from nouns, property nouns from adjectives, action nouns from verbs, bigger, smaller versions, opposites, people who are working in a certain field, objects from verbs, like food from to eat, places, like a restaurant from the word for to eat, tools, and like screwdriver from to screw, or a printer from to print, and affixes to force the transitivity and intransitivity. And if you use some of the examples that I gave in this talk, then you have some words that you can ask your teacher about, because usually they're not aware of it. I mean, even as native speakers, we're not generally aware of how do we do this in our language. But if you try a few words, then you probably see a few that have a pattern. Not all of them, but most of them. And I hope that that will help you. Okay, thank you very much. Do you have questions? Yeah?
Yes, is it working? Yeah. So thank you so much. I loved it. But I have a question about Chinese. So one, can you use bu as mal Esperanto, like buhao in this one? And the other one, you had example when something you make it bigger, but also you have something smaller, it's double. How do you know the difference about that? So if it's a really doggy or it's a huge dog. So this is, I found it really confusing. Thank you.
Okay, first the bu in Chinese is just a not, so it's like ne in Esperanto. You know, in Esperanto you can also say ne bone. Okay. It's not the same as mal bone.
Okay.
Yeah, not good is not the same as bad. Yes. We're looking for the exact opposite. That would be with fei.
Okay.
Yes, and to go back with these prefixes that are doubled, it depends on the language and it depends on the word type. So in Chinese, if you have a doubled noun, then it becomes cutesy. But if you have a doubled adjective, then it has increased intensity. Yeah, so it's complicated. In Esperanto, you just use egg for stronger or more intense in both cases, for nouns and adjectives, and in Chinese you have to watch out.
Okay.
Yes?
Thank you for this. As a native Finnish speaker, I'm already used to using affixes for creating new words, but it was really fascinating to find out that other languages do them like in such similar ways to us. Considering using these in language teaching, do you think this is something one should bring up for their student in an early stage of learning, or rather when they have reached some kind of conversational level? Like, do you think this will confuse them or help them?
I think that it depends on how common these patterns are and how useful the words are that are associated with them. I think that generally I would probably put them at the intermediate level, but it depends, because for example in Hebrew and Arabic I had a lot of trouble with words sounding too similar because of the same patterns with just a few or even just one consonant being different and the word meaning changing completely. So in that case, it really helped me to understand, to sit down with an Esperanto-speaking friend and just compare what's going on here and how do you say this in Hebrew and how does this work.
Okay, thank
so
you.
when you have students who have trouble with this kind of thing or generally with learning vocabulary, then you can consider doing it earlier.
Thank you.
Other questions? Okay, then thank you very much. I'm happy to talk about this.